I told my family I had lost everything. My company was gone, my savings were gone, and I might even lose my home. 6 weeks later, not one of them was calling anymore. What broke my heart wasn't the silence itself. It was realizing how quickly the people I loved disappeared when they thought I had nothing left to give. But there was one thing they didn't know, and what happened when the truth finally came out taught me a painful lesson about love, family, and worth. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell me your city and state in the comments below. I read as many of your comments as I can, and stories like this remind us that pain doesn't belong to just one family. My name is Eleanor Mitchell. I'm 72 years old, and I live in Ohio. 8 years ago, I lost my husband, Richard. Even now, saying those words still hurts. Richard wasn't just my husband. He was my partner in every sense of the word. The kind of man who believed in me before I believed in myself. The kind of man who would sit at the kitchen table late at night, surrounded by unpaid bills, and somehow make me feel like everything was going to be okay. Back in 1982, when I told him I wanted to start my own marketing company, most people thought I was dreaming too big. Richard didn't. He walked into a bank and signed papers that put our house on the line. For me. For us. For a future neither of us could see yet. I still remember asking him if he was scared. He smiled and squeezed my hand. Not if we're building it together. For the next 4 decades, that's exactly what we did. There were years when we barely slept. Years when every dollar mattered. Years when failure sat so close to us that I could almost hear it breathing. But somehow we kept going. And eventually, the tiny company we built from a typewriter and a telephone became something much bigger than either of us ever imagined. Yet when I think about those years now, I don't remember the contracts. I don't remember the profits. I remember the people. My daughter Jessica. My son Daniel. My younger sister Patricia. And my best friend Caroline. They were the center of my world. Every Thanksgiving, my house was full. Every Christmas, the dining room overflowed with laughter. Every birthday meant another excuse to gather around the same table Richard and I had spent decades filling with food, stories, and love. Sunday dinners became a tradition nobody questioned. People came and went. Children grew up. Grandchildren arrived. But somehow we always ended up around that table. At least that's what I believed. And because I loved them, I helped whenever they needed me. Sometimes it was advice. Sometimes it was time. Sometimes it was money. I never kept score. That's what family does, right? You show up. You give. You help. And you trust that love is being returned, even when nobody says it out loud. Looking back now, I realize there were moments I should have paid more attention to. Tiny moments. The kind that seem harmless when they happen. A joke that lingers too long. A comment that feels slightly off. A look exchanged across a room. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough to leave a faint ache you can't explain. I ignored those moments. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself family was family. But one Sunday evening, sitting at the head of my own dining table, I heard something that made a strange feeling settle into my chest. Not fear. Not anger. Something colder. At the time, I brushed it aside. I wish I hadn't. Because that small moment became the first crack in a story I thought I understood. And once I saw that crack, I couldn't stop seeing it. Jessica was the first person who made me notice the pattern. One Tuesday afternoon, I was watering flowers on my porch when my phone rang. "Hi, Mom." I smiled immediately. "Jessica. How are the kids?" There was a brief hesitation. "They're good. Listen. Mark and I have a problem." "Of course." I lowered the watering can. The roof needed repairs. Again. The estimate was nearly $20,000. I listened. I asked questions. I promised to help. 3 days later, the money was transferred. And 3 days after that, I didn't hear from her at all. The same thing happened again 6 months later. Then again the year after. Different crisis. Different amount. Same phone call. Same ending. One evening I sat staring at my call history. Jessica's name appeared dozens of times. Almost every conversation began with affection. Almost every conversation ended with money. And suddenly a thought slipped into my mind. I couldn't remember the last time my daughter called simply to ask if I was okay. I wish that realization had been the most painful one. It wasn't. Because Daniel came next. My son had always been a dreamer. Every family has one. A restaurant. An app. A consulting business. An online marketplace. A real estate venture. A fitness startup. 6 businesses. 6 failures. 6 times he sat across from me and said the same thing. "Mom, I just need one more chance." And every time, I believed him. One afternoon he arrived carrying a binder full of charts. "Mom, this one is different." "That's what you said last time." He laughed. "Okay, but this time I mean it." I wrote another check. Months later the business collapsed. Again. When I called to ask how he was doing, his voice was distracted. "I'm working on something new." What happened to the last project? It just wasn't the right market. Not once did he mention paying me back. Not once did he ask whether I could afford another investment. As I hung up, I rubbed my forehead and heard Richard's voice from years ago. "Be careful, Ellie. Helping someone is different from carrying them." Back then I thought he was being too cautious. Now I wasn't so sure. And what I noticed next felt even harder to ignore. Patricia never called about emergencies. She called about expenses. Property taxes. Medical bills. Vacation plans. One afternoon she excitedly described a cruise she'd found. "It would be wonderful if we could go together." "It sounds expensive." "Well." She laughed softly. "You always find a way." The words landed strangely. Not cruel. Not demanding. Just expected. As though my help had become part of the natural order of things. That night I sat in silence for a long time. The people I loved most no longer seemed surprised when I gave. They seemed surprised when I didn't. And then there was Caroline. 38 years of friendship. Weekly lunches. Holiday traditions. Thousands of conversations. One afternoon she asked to meet for coffee. She looked worried. "I hate asking this." "Then don't hate it," I joked. "How much do you need?" She laughed. 5,000. I transferred the money before dessert arrived. Months passed. No repayment. No mention of repayment. Only another lunch. Another crisis. Another request. As I drove home that evening, a question followed me all the way back to my house. If I stopped helping, What would remain? A few weeks later, everyone gathered around my dining table for Sunday dinner. The conversation drifted toward money. Mark complained about expenses. Amy mentioned rising costs. Patricia worried about taxes. Caroline talked about car repairs. Then Jessica laughed and lifted her wine glass. Well, Mom will help. That's what the family bank is for. The room exploded with laughter. Daniel raised his glass. To Mom's success. More laughter. I smiled. I even laughed with them. But something happened inside me. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger sitting at my own table. And as I looked around that room, I realized a question had begun forming in my mind. One question I could no longer ignore. What would happen if the family bank suddenly closed? That question followed me upstairs that night. By midnight, the house was quiet. By 1 a.m, I was still sitting at the kitchen table. By 3, I hadn't moved. Old photo albums were spread across the wood surface. Receipts. Cards. School pictures. Vacation photos. 40 years of memories. I picked up a photograph of Jessica at 12 years old, smiling with braces on her teeth. I remembered paying for piano lessons she eventually quit. I remembered helping Daniel after his first business failed. I remembered Patricia's medical bills. Caroline's emergencies. The weddings. The birthdays. The vacations. The bailouts. The late-night phone calls. The tears. The promises. I had never regretted helping them. But for the first time, I asked myself something I had spent years avoiding. What had they ever sacrificed for me? My chest tightened. I looked around the empty kitchen. Richard's chair sat across from me. For a second, I could almost hear him. Ellie, love should never have to be purchased. I lowered my eyes. Because deep down, I was starting to fear that maybe it had been. And once that thought entered my mind, I couldn't force it back out. So I asked myself a question that terrified me. If I had no money, would they still love me? The words hung in the darkness. I hated the question. Because part of me already feared the answer. The next morning, I drove to the office. Not because I needed to. Because I needed clarity. For months, Meridian Solutions had been receiving acquisition offers. I had ignored them. Richard and I had built that company together. Selling it felt like closing the final chapter of our life. But now something had changed. I sat across from the lead buyer. Are you still interested? He nodded. Very. The negotiations lasted 4 months. Lawyers. Contracts. Meetings. Signatures. I told almost nobody. Not Jessica. Not Daniel. Not Patricia. Not even Caroline. When the final paperwork was completed, the sale price was $12.5 million. I stared at the number on the page. Then I thought about that question again. If I had no money, would they still love me? And suddenly I realized there was only one way to find out. A week later, I invited everyone to dinner. The same dining room. The same table. The same smiling faces. Jessica brought wine. Daniel talked about a new opportunity. Patricia discussed travel plans. Caroline laughed at an old story. Everything looked normal. Which made what I was about to do even harder. I waited until dessert. Then I set down my fork. I need to tell you something. The room grew quiet. Jessica frowned. "What is it, Mom?" I took a breath. "My company is gone." Silence. Daniel blinked. "What do you mean gone?" "I lost it." Patricia slowly lowered her glass. Caroline stopped smiling. I continued. "The business failed. Most of my savings are gone. I may have to sell the house." Nobody spoke. Not immediately. I watched their faces. Shock first. Then confusion. Then something else. Something I wasn't prepared to see. And as I sat there looking at the people I loved most, I realized this conversation was about to reveal far more than money. Because the expressions appearing around that table didn't look like concern. They looked like calculation. And what happened next broke my heart in ways I never saw coming. Jessica was the first to speak. She stared at me across the table, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. "Mom. How bad is it?" I swallowed. "Bad enough that I may have to sell the house." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Jessica leaned back in her chair. Not toward me. Away from me. A tiny movement. But I noticed it. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "How can I help?" What are you going to do? My fingers tightened around my fork. I don't know yet. Jessica exhaled heavily. "Mom, I love you, but I can't take this on. Mark and I have our own problems." The words hit harder than I expected. Because I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't asking for rescue. Yet somehow I had already become a burden. In that moment, I realized something painful. The woman who had spent decades solving everyone else's problems had suddenly become a problem herself. And the conversation was only getting started. Mark cleared his throat. At first, he looked uncomfortable. Then disappointment crossed his face. A very specific kind of disappointment. "The SUV," he said quietly. Jessica looked at him. "Mark." "What?" "We've been planning it for months." I felt my stomach drop. They weren't discussing my future. They were discussing theirs. "The new car will probably have to wait now." He shook his head and stared into his drink. I watched him calculate a loss that wasn't actually his. And I heard Richard's voice in my memory. "When people start counting your money before you do, be careful." Back then, I thought he was being cynical. Sitting there, I wondered if he had simply seen the truth before I did. Then Daniel spoke. My son rubbed both hands across his face. "This is terrible timing. Terrible timing. Not terrible news. Not terrible for Mom. Terrible timing." I blinked. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. Then sighed. "I was going to ask if you'd look at a proposal next month." There it was. Another business idea. Another investment. Another expectation. The proposal mattered more than the person sitting in front of him. I felt a hollow ache spread through my chest. For years I thought Daniel saw me as his biggest supporter. Now I wasn't sure he saw me at all. And before I could process that realization, Amy leaned forward. She looked genuinely stunned. "We thought you were going to invest." Nobody corrected her. Nobody looked embarrassed. Nobody said, "Amy, this isn't the time." The room remained silent. I looked around the table. Jessica. Mark. Daniel. Amy. The people I would have done anything for. The people I had done everything for. I expected concern. I found disappointment. I expected family. I found expectations. And for the first time, a terrifying thought settled into my heart. Maybe they weren't grieving what I had lost. Maybe they were grieving what they thought they had lost. As that realization sank in, Patricia slowly lowered her glass and opened her mouth. What she said next hurt even more than everything that came before. Patricia slowly set down her wine glass. For a second, I thought she was about to ask if I needed help. Instead, she frowned. Wait. What about the cruise next month? The room went quiet again. I blinked. The cruise? Yes. The Alaska trip. We already started planning. I felt my throat tighten. Out of everything I had just said, that was what worried her. Not the company. Not the house. Not me. The vacation. I forced a small smile. I don't think a cruise is my biggest concern right now. Patricia looked embarrassed for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked disappointed. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't mourning my loss. She was mourning the loss of something she expected to receive. Before I could process that, Caroline leaned forward. My oldest friend. Nearly 40 years together. If things are really that bad, she said carefully. What about the money you loaned me? I stared at her. The 5,000? She nodded. Do you need it back right away? My stomach dropped. Not because of the money. Because of the question. She wasn't asking how I was surviving. She was asking whether her debt had become a problem. I suddenly remembered every emergency, every favor, every promise to repay me later. And for the first time, I wondered if later had ever been real. Then something happened that hurt more than all the words combined. Nobody said anything. Not Jessica. Not Daniel. Not Patricia. Not Caroline. Nobody asked, Mom, are you okay? Nobody said, we'll help you. Nobody said, you're not alone. I sat there waiting. Waiting for someone to reach across the table. Waiting for someone to sound like family. Nobody did. I had spent 40 years catching people when they fell. That night, I learned how many people were willing to watch me fall. One by one, they started leaving. Jessica hugged me quickly. Daniel checked his phone. Patricia gathered her purse. Caroline promised we'd talk soon. The front door opened. Closed. Opened again. Closed again. Until eventually the house became silent. I stood alone in the dining room. Half-finished wine glasses. Dirty plates. Empty chairs. The evidence of a family gathering. Without any feeling of family. If you've ever been hurt by the people you trusted most, take a moment to subscribe. Because what happened next exposed a truth far more painful than this dinner ever could. I walked into the kitchen and stared at Richard's empty chair. For years, I believed my greatest fear was losing money. That night, I discovered a worse fear. Realizing the people you love may only love what you provide. And as I stood there in the silence, my phone lit up with a message. The sender made my heart stop. Because it proved this nightmare was only beginning. Days passed. Then weeks. My phone stayed silent. No calls from Jessica. No messages from Daniel. No surprise visits. At first, I kept making excuses for them. They must be busy. But busy people still send a text. Busy people still remember their mother exists. One morning I checked my voicemail. Empty. For the first time, I stopped waiting. A year before I would tell this story, my 71st birthday arrived. It became the day that changed everything. I woke up expecting at least one call. Just one. Morning passed. Afternoon passed. Night arrived. Nothing. Not a single message. Not a single card. Not a single voice. I sat alone with a small cake from the grocery store and finally understood something. I didn't lose my family that day. I realized I had never truly had them. The next week, I hired a private investigator. I told myself I wanted answers. The truth was, I wanted proof that I was wrong. I wasn't. Jessica complained about me to friends. Daniel had been exaggerating his business losses for years. Patricia still went on the cruise. Caroline told people I was becoming difficult. Each report felt like another door closing. Each discovery made Richard's old warnings harder to ignore. So I stopped crying. And I started planning. I met with an attorney. Updated my will. Reviewed every asset. Made decisions nobody knew about. Then I found a villa in Tuscany. For the first time in months, I smiled. I wasn't smiling because of the villa. I was smiling because, for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to earn love. For decades, I believed sacrifice created loyalty. I was wrong. Every check I wrote. Every crisis I solved. Every rescue I provided. Had taught people that my purpose was to give. Not to be loved. Not to be valued. To give. That realization changed everything. For the first time, I stopped asking who needed me. And started asking who truly loved me. Because I finally understood something. The people who disappeared when they thought I had nothing were revealing exactly who they were. And soon, every one of them would sit at my table again. The difference was, this time I would be the one holding the truth. A week before Thanksgiving, I called everyone. I'd love for us to have dinner together. Jessica sounded relieved. Of course, Mom. Daniel agreed immediately. Even Patricia seemed excited. By Thursday evening, every seat around the table was filled again. The same smiles. The same laughter. The same people who had disappeared when they thought I had nothing. I waited until dessert. Then I stood up. I have one more thing to tell you. The room quieted. I looked at each face before speaking. I didn't lose my company. Jessica froze. Daniel frowned. Patricia lowered her fork. I sold it. Nobody moved. $12.5 million. The silence felt endless. Then chaos. Mom, why would you do this? Jessica whispered. Daniel's face turned pale. Patricia started crying. Caroline kept repeating, I don't understand. But they understood. Every one of them understood. The tears came. The apologies followed. Promises. Excuses. Regrets. Suddenly everyone wanted another chance. Suddenly everyone remembered they loved me. Jessica reached for my hand. Mom, we made mistakes. Daniel looked like he might cry. We can fix this. Patricia wiped her eyes. We're still family. I looked around the table. 6 weeks earlier, none of them could find 5 minutes to call. Now they wanted hours. Now they wanted forgiveness. Now they wanted access. And that's when I finally understood something that had taken me 72 years to learn. Money had not changed them. Money had revealed them. Too late. The people who abandoned me when they thought I was broke were not mourning me. They were mourning access. Funny how love returned the moment the money did. For 6 weeks, they couldn't find time to call. Yet somehow they found time to beg. You cannot lose people who were never truly standing beside you. A month later, I watched the sunrise from a villa in Tuscany. Golden light covered the hills. For the first time in years, my phone was silent and my heart was peaceful. Richard had been right all along. Love that depends on what you provide is not love. And sometimes the greatest revenge is not taking something away. It's refusing to keep giving it. Thank you for listening to my story. But before I end, let me leave you with one question: if everything you own disappeared tomorrow, who would still be sitting at your table?